I'm Jim Morningstar, and I am the host for this 9-session series called Returning to Source. And this segment of our Returning to Source series is Educational Wounding and Innate Intelligence, Restorative Breathwork. And I am so delighted to have our guest speaker, Ann Harrison, who is a veteran breathworker and trainer of over 30 years, who is the co-director and one of the founders of the Breathwork Training International in Australia. Anne is particularly situated to talk about trauma in the educational system. And my dear colleague and friend, I have a question for you, and that is, why is there trauma in educational systems as you see it? And how does breath work effectively heal educational trauma?
Jim, this is such an interesting question. I mean, you warned me in email that this is the question you wanted answered. And when I contemplated it, for me, I didn't resonate at all with trauma in education. I've been a teacher all my life. I was a high school teacher, then a university lecturer, and then I trained teachers in a conventional sense. So when I talked to my colleague Robin Finance in breathwork trainings, she neither could resonate with trauma in education, yet she wrote a book, Being Born, How Your Birth Script Affects Your Learning, Your Relationships and Life, recognizing, as we do with breathwork, that there is trauma for different people in different areas of their life. But for me, the trauma, as it affects an individual, their psyche, their brain, is no different whether it's within education or not. There are particular ways that the trauma can happen, but what it does to the individual is no different from when it's in the family or in the workplace or in school.
Okay. Well, also I thought about it, and both you and I have been worked with clients for 30 some years. We know that people come in with things that have happened to them in the classroom, things that have happened even outside of the classroom that are traumatic. The educational system is something that a society creates in order to have their children imbued with the values, what the society considers valuable. And as we know, there are clashes of values in almost every society that's not just a totally isolated tribe, perhaps somewhere, that in our multicultural societies, conflict in values is what leads to warfare, to extreme alienation. And it often starts right in the classroom. I had a teacher once who was a client of mine who came in extremely upset because she lit a candle in her classroom to help students just focus, and she was teaching them a little how to quiet their mind. And she was roundly attacked by a parent who thought this was some sort of a cult.
I think there are two things that we can talk about here. And I agree with you. The education system is a system in its, if the most pejorative way of saying it is, it's an indoctrination system. The education that a society uses is to produce the sort of society it wants. And so everything within that education system is designed to perpetuate the society and the interests and values and influence of the ruling class. That I totally accept. And when I was a conventional teacher, I had various ways of dealing with that, different methods of teaching within a conventional classroom. But as breathwork practitioners, we're teaching more than that. You know, we have to deal with what happens in schools with children and their shaming, their bullying, they're coming from family background with different values. But what I think we're teaching in breathwork is embodied knowledge of spirit. Now, when breathwork is the use of the breath to release suppressed emotions, source unconscious beliefs and attitudes, release them, and reprogram oneself into what we need as a worldview. We work with the prana, we work with the chi and the breath. That's the way I see it primarily. Yes, we have all the overlays of the conscious mind, but it's a work of spirit within the body, learning, helping an individual to experience themselves like that. Now, when an individual experiences themselves as spirit, as what can happen in most cases in breathwork sessions, there is a sense of worth and value and expansion of possibilities that one doesn't get within a normal education system. We just, it's not designed to do that anyway. It's designed to form people for a society. Breathwork is designed to help people live in a society, but be fully themselves with access to all their potential.
And what fascinated me about what you did, because as far as I know, you were the first one that had a government accredit experiential learning that has such a non-traditional basis underneath it. And I remember stories you telling about how challenging that was, because you would have to fit all of your curriculum into molds that were created for a very different approach to learning.
Well, it was frustrating, like you said. It could have been considered traumatic, but you see, I knew before I even went to school I was destined to be a teacher. That truly is my vocation.
Yes.
And I had spent a decade in the East, in a remote area in the countryside in Hong Kong, China, creating a meditation center, retreat center, doing my own retreat. I was without radio, television, or newspapers for fully 7 years. And so when I came back, I had the two parts of me, the part that had been the recluse, the spiritual teacher, the contemplator, and the educator in the conventional sense. And part of my values were to want to create a society where what breathwork gives, which is the integration of spirit within the individual, but then within the society as a whole, try and give that a place in society. So Australia is lucky because it had an educational framework, a government educational framework that allowed for that possibility. Most other countries don't have that. So we have a set of generic criteria from kindergarten to PhD level. And if you can situate yourself within school education, vocational education, academic education, you can write a course for it. And so that's what we did. And because it was experiential learning, and all educators will have been dealing with experiential learning for more than a half a century, a long time now. I think breathwork is totally experiential. So while I might have liked the idea momentarily of situating it within a higher learning institution, the university, I acknowledge that what it was really was a set of skills and embodied knowledge. And so in that Australian government system, it was situated within the vocational education area. Mm-hmm. So, but it was my values as an educator and my experience in both worlds, in the conventional mainstream world of teaching, training teachers, academia, and the non-conventional world. Because when I set up in the countryside in Hong Kong, that challenged my values because it's laissez-faire capitalism in those days. That was in the late 80s. And I had to set up on my own, away from the big city, in the countryside, and integrate in a different way into society. So this balance of, for an individual, integrating spirit with emotions, physicality, and thoughts, integrating the individual within society, all those parts. I think they're the challenges of living in a world of duality. And while we might have a holistic framework, and at moments have the experience of ourselves as part of the totality, we're always trying to navigate the either or, this or that, expansion or contraction, you or me.
Yes, and for me, the tool that we use in that sort of discrimination is the mind, because the mind works like a binary computer. It's either or. So either your spirit or your matter, or you're male or you're female, or you're right or you're wrong.
Yeah.
And we have to use our mind, but the mind can also be educated in a way that it recognizes there's something outside of the mind. There's something that is not to be contained or controlled by the mind, which is a threat, can be a threat to society, that there's something that they can't control. Yes.
The way I prefer to see it is the mind is part of something greater. And the recent book by Daniel Goleman, The Science of Meditation, where he looks at how meditation rewires the brain. It's fascinating. It totally validates what breathwork practitioners have known and been doing for decades and decades now, that what we focus on changes the very structure of the brain, which then determines the perceptions that we are able to have and that we have. And so those things that I used to cringe, in the old days, the creative power of thought, self-fulfilling prophecy, but it's all there now, being validated in science, in neuroscience research, that the experience of an individual in breathwork of being part of a greater whole and then bringing the intellectual mind, the thoughts, to bear on that experience, expands one's sense of self and one's possibilities in the world. And in that, the trauma and wounding, whether it's from in schools or whether it's in family situations, other biographical times in one's life, the wounds get healed not by fighting against them and addressing them as such, but by giving oneself the experience of something bigger and better and more amazing than the mind could ever imagine.
So there seems to be a tension between growth and status quo. Well, I suppose it's like yoga. You've got to find just the right stretch. If you push too hard and too far, there's pain. If you don't, you're stuck in the way things always were. An educational system, I think, for those who are looking for more than the status quo, will have their children push the limits, will encourage it, even though it's uncomfortable. And so a lot of new ideologies and a lot of new thoughts happen in the college, in the university. And we applaud that creativity until it pinches too much.
But you see, that's where breathwork, for me, and the breathwork practitioner, is such a fail-safe way of pushing. Because you and I know that if someone isn't ready to go to a certain place within themselves, we can prod and poke and encourage and do all sorts of things to try and keep the breath flowing and them working with the process. But if they're not internally ready for that process, they won't go there. So the support and the open-heartedness and the unconditional acceptance of a breathwork practitioner are the necessary prerequisites for an individual to push the limits to the limit.
Yes. I love the new neuroscience terms for things that we have talked about in the past. You're talking about the social engagement system, that we're warm, accepting, and there's a prosodic voice. These are things that signal to the mammalian part of the vagus nerve that it's safe. We reprogram some of that fight and flight things, which is the more primitive part of the vagus nerve, and we go towards resolution and integration rather towards the deepest level of freezing
It's quite wonderful to see that research now come through, because it's totally confirming what we knew about the breath, whether it's stimulation of the vagus nerve and the balance of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, the creation of the maximal heart rate variability and all the system that flows from that. We've got the research there now. I bother to keep myself informed, but I don't bother to try and retain the details too much. I have the reference list for my students so they can go and read up on it if that's their inclination. But it's the experience that we know changes people. Can I just tell you about, just briefly, I was presenting at a mental health conference just recently on the relationship between mindfulness, meditation, and breathwork. And I drew on a lot of these things in neuroscience, but very especially, I looked at the research as summarized by Goldman in that book, The Science of Meditation. And what they have found is what you do affects certain parts of the brain. Monks that have been meditating and concentrating and focusing on presence stimulated a certain part of the brain, while other monks who were focusing on compassion, another part of the brain was stimulated. Now, my excitement was almost uncontainable when I realized that breath work gives both the client and the practitioner the exercise of both, because you have to focus on the sensations of the breath and the body as you're breathing as a client. As a practitioner, you're observing that, so you're focusing on breath and being totally present. But what heals is compassion, the unconditional regard, is in conventional psychology, for both the client and the practitioner. So breath work is a supreme modality for self-knowledge and self-healing. And both the client and the practitioner get the benefit.
Exactly.
Yes.
And I know you are also a certified meditation teacher.
Yes.
And meditation often, I won't say always, I'll defer to your knowledge about this, but often uses breath awareness as
Absolutely.
part of its skill set. And now neuroscience is telling us what we used to call monkey mind, that thing that happens when you do not focus.
Yeah.
They call it the default mode network.
Yes.
And the default mode network takes us into self-referential thinking, which is often criticism of ourselves and so on. Whereas if I am focusing on my breath and mindful and non-judgmental, I stay out of the default mode network. I'm more in the social engagement network. And consequently, my parasympathetic nervous system of calmness and joy is more prevalent in my life than worry and all of the things that happen when I just let my mind wander, as it were.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So simple. So simple.
They're showing now that the gyrification in the brain, the folds in the brain, which in every animal species is correlated with intelligence, is much greater with people who meditate for years.
Yeah. Exactly.
In fact, all of the parts of the brain are helped and reinforced. So I think it's the era of vindication for things that we've been doing to put the right and the left side of the brain together with breath work.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So thrilling for someone, first of all, when the research in neuroscience started to come out, and then in Australia at least, everyone's talking about being aware of the breath and using the breath. And I'm thinking, oh, it's only taken 30 years for that to hit mainstream, but it's now here. And I was lecturing at a university with orientation for students, and a few years ago hardly anyone had meditated, and the last year I did it, 3/4 to 90% had meditated. These were college students, and I thought, gosh, what a difference in a short space of time. If only the population at large could really begin to practice this self-awareness and touching the place inside themselves, which they know is the same in everyone else on the planet. Mm.
And how that is seeping into the educational system. I read recently of experiments done in high-risk schools in the San Francisco area, where they instituted periods of meditation, focused concentration, and breath awareness throughout the day. The students that had been in these programs, and these are high-risk students, these are not, high achiever in the special schools, they raised their GPA scores by points.
Wow. Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it?
Yes.
And the students seem to love it, because I mean, I've got caught up in social media and things like that, and the pace, which since I was much younger, the pace has picked up enormously, and the need for the organism to rest is now crucial. Otherwise, we're always on. The adrenals and that get overloaded. We haven't got the time and space just to regenerate, really, to recuperate.
Well, as we were talking about earlier, the educational system is often what the society uses to imbue values in the next generation. And since our values are changing from much more of the control and indoctrination to open systems and experimentation and learning from the body in a holistic way, we need educational tools now to fit that. And well, breath work and breath awareness and meditation seem to be the tools, as you say, par excellence.
Exactly. And it's in the teachers. I mean, I have a lot of clients that are teachers, and they're one comes to mind that's in children with disabilities, so very difficult students. She lies them down a couple of times a day on the floor and takes them through a meditation, and it's a matter of survival. And I think teachers are actually discovering, if they can find a quiet time, and the apps that are available these days, even if a teacher isn't confident to do something by themselves, they've got an app there that students will just happily use. And so survival, I reckon, for teachers in the first place, using meditation, but then, as you say, it's a value and an experience that will lay the foundation for a future society that's hopefully a little better.
Well, there have been forerunners in this. One of our original breathwork trainers in our school was a former principal in elementary school. And of course, the tradition here is that if there's a bad boy or a bad girl, they get sent to the principal, which is the ultimate weapon. Well, she had a counter weapon to having to be the enforcer. She had a cot in the back part of her office. And so when the bad boy or the bad girl came, she'd have them lay down and breathe and meditate.
That's wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. I reckon it'd work every time. Most of the time.
Well, so I so appreciate your sharing some of your experience and your views on this. And I've always considered you a sister, so to speak, in this movement of bringing a new form of education to our world. I'm so happy that you practice these principles and not just teach them, because you are still so vibrant and so excited about the work that you're doing and training breath workers continually.
Nothing more exciting, Jim. And I was touched to hear what you just said then. To be considered a sister by one of the leaders in the field of breathwork is pretty special. So thank you.
Oh, well, I think we're marching to the same tune. And so I don't know who's leading who, but that's the difference now in our model, is that we're doing something together through collaborative intelligence. as I was teaching by video conference in the Mideast this last weekend, I said to the person who was there, the local person who was actually doing the hands-on work, I just got to speak, and I said, we're now about creating communities, not empires.
Yeah. Yes.
So thank you for your contribution to this community building here in our Returning to Source group. And I look forward to continually growing with you and finding out more about what your adventures are on the other side of the world, down under.
Down under. Jim, it's been my great, great pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, blessings.